December 7, 1941. The Kremlin, Moscow. Joseph Stalin stood before a massive wall map of the Soviet Union, studying red pins that marked German positions now just 60 miles from the capital. Snow fell outside the windows of his office as temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. German Army Group Center had advanced 500 miles in 5 months, destroying entire Soviet armies, capturing 3 million prisoners, seizing the Ukraine's industrial heartland. By every measure of military science, the Soviet Union should have collapsed. German generals calculated that the Red Army had lost more tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces than the rest of the world combined possessed. Soviet industrial production had fallen by 60%. 20 million Soviet citizens lived under German occupation. Moscow's evacuation had already begun. Yet Stalin was not planning surrender. He was planning something the German High Command considered impossible. A winter offensive that would push German forces back from Moscow and begin a counterattack that would ultimately carry Soviet armies all the way to Berlin. What made this confidence possible was a secret that German intelligence had catastrophically underestimated. At that moment, 4,000 miles away in Detroit, Michigan, production lines at the Willow Run plant were operating 24 hours a day, building B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. In California's shipyards, Liberty ships were being launched every 4.5 days. Across the American industrial heartland, factories that had produced automobiles and refrigerators were retooling to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The United States had not yet officially entered the war. Pearl Harbor was still hours away. But President Franklin Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program was already transforming American industrial capacity into a weapon that would prove more decisive than any tank or aircraft. A logistics miracle that would ultimately deliver 5 million tons of military supplies to the Soviet Union and crush Germany's entire Eastern strategy through American abundance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was the largest military operation in human history. 3.5 million German soldiers, supported by Finnish, Romanian, and Hungarian forces, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Wehrmacht deployed 6,500 tanks, 4,700 aircraft, and 600,000 motorized vehicles. German planning was meticulous and based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse within 3 months. Army Group North would capture Leningrad. Army Group Center would take Moscow. Army Group South would seize Kiev and the industrial regions of Ukraine. The entire campaign was designed to destroy Soviet military capacity before winter arrived. Initial German success exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Soviet forces, caught completely by surprise despite numerous intelligence warnings, suffered catastrophic defeats. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. The Luftwaffe achieved immediate air superiority, destroying over 4,000 Soviet aircraft in the first week, most of them on the ground. By September 1941, German forces had advanced further into Soviet territory than Napoleon had reached in his entire 1812 campaign. Army Group Center stood just 60 miles from Moscow. Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group South had captured Kiev and was advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields. German casualties were relatively light. Wehrmacht losses through September totaled approximately 400,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Soviet losses were staggering. Conservative estimates placed Red Army casualties at over 2 million killed and 3 million captured. Entire Soviet military districts had been eliminated. Tank armies had been destroyed without inflicting significant damage on German forces. The speed and scale of German success convinced most observers, including many in the Soviet leadership, that collapse was inevitable. British intelligence estimated that the Soviet Union would be forced to seek a separate peace by Christmas 1941. American military advisors calculated that effective Soviet resistance would end within 6 months. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on July 3, 1941, just 11 days after the invasion began. It is probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. This assessment reflected not arrogance, but realistic analysis based on the scale of Soviet defeats. Yet, beneath the apparent German triumph, critical weaknesses were already becoming apparent to careful observers. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, designed for short campaigns in Western Europe, was straining under the demands of operations across the vast distances of the Soviet Union. German trucks, designed for European roads, broke down repeatedly on Russian dirt tracks. The German railway system required extensive reconstruction because Soviet rail lines used a different gauge than European railways. This meant that supplies arriving at the Soviet border had to be transferred to different trains or trucks, creating bottlenecks that grew worse as German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory. Most critically, German industrial production was insufficient to replace the equipment being lost to combat, mechanical failure, and the sheer wear and tear of extended operations. Wehrmacht tank strength actually declined during the first months of Barbarossa despite spectacular tactical victories because losses exceeded German manufacturing capacity. The Soviet response to the German invasion initially appeared chaotic and hopeless. Entire command structures had been destroyed in the opening German attacks. Communications were severed, supply lines were cut. Military districts that existed on June 21st had simply vanished by July. Stalin himself seemed paralyzed during the first days of the invasion. He had ignored repeated intelligence warnings about German preparations, apparently believing that Hitler would not risk a two-front war. When the attack began, Stalin reportedly retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and refused to see visitors for several days. Yet, even as the Red Army suffered its worst defeats, critical decisions were being made that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. Soviet factories in threatened areas were being dismantled and evacuated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire industrial complexes were loaded onto trains and moved to safety, along with their workers and machinery. This evacuation was unprecedented in scale and speed. Between July and November 1941, Soviet authorities relocated over 1,500 industrial enterprises, including aircraft factories, tank plants, artillery works, and steel mills. Over 10 million workers and their families were evacuated along with the factories. The relocated industries were reassembled in remote areas of Siberia and Central Asia, far beyond the reach of German bombers. By winter 1941, these factories were already beginning to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery to replace the equipment lost in the opening disasters. But Soviet industrial evacuation alone would not have been sufficient to sustain resistance against the Wehrmacht. The scale of early losses was simply too enormous. The Red Army needed immediate infusions of equipment to prevent complete collapse. This is where American Lend-Lease assistance became decisive. The Lend-Lease program had been signed into law by President Roosevelt on March 11, 1941, 3 months before Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Originally designed to support Britain, which was fighting alone against Nazi Germany, the program authorized the United States to provide military equipment to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to American security. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Roosevelt made the crucial decision to extend Lend-Lease assistance to the Soviet government despite strong domestic opposition. Many Americans viewed Stalin's communist regime as equally evil to Hitler's Nazi Germany. Public opinion polls showed that most Americans opposed aid to the Soviet Union. Roosevelt overruled this opposition because he understood that Soviet resistance was essential to ultimate Allied victory. As long as the Wehrmacht was engaged on the Eastern Front, Germany could not concentrate its full strength against Britain or prepare for the inevitable American entry into the war. The first Lend-Lease convoy to the Soviet Union departed from American ports in August 1941. It carried aircraft, tanks, trucks, and other military equipment desperately needed by Soviet forces. But this initial shipment was tiny compared to what would follow over the next 4 years. By December 1941, as German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow, American supply convoys were already arriving in Soviet ports carrying equipment that would prove decisive in the coming winter offensive. Soviet tank armies that counterattacked German positions around Moscow included substantial numbers of American-built Sherman tanks and British Churchill tanks provided through Lend-Lease. The impact of Lend-Lease assistance extended far beyond individual weapons systems. American industrial production supplemented Soviet manufacturing in critical areas where domestic production was insufficient. This was particularly important for trucks, aircraft, communications equipment, and raw materials. German intelligence consistently underestimated the scale and impact of Allied assistance to the Soviet Union. Wehrmacht planning assumed that Soviet industrial capacity, already strained by evacuation and German bombing, could not sustain prolonged resistance. German analysts calculated that the Red Army would run out of modern equipment within 6 months. These calculations failed to account for the fact that American factories were producing military equipment for the Soviet Union on a scale that exceeded Soviet domestic production in many categories. By 1942, American Lend-Lease deliveries included more trucks than the entire German military possessed. The winter of 1941 to 1942 marked the first major German setback on the Eastern Front. Soviet counteroffensives around Moscow, Leningrad, and in the south pushed German forces back hundreds of miles. Wehrmacht divisions that had seemed invincible during the summer campaign found themselves retreating in bitter cold, abandoning equipment and suffering massive casualties. German generals attributed this reversal to winter weather and extended supply lines. They failed to recognize that Soviet resistance was being sustained by American industrial production. Tank armies that attacked German positions were equipped with American trucks for logistics, American aircraft for close air support, and American communications equipment for coordination. The Battle of Moscow, which raged from December 1941 through January 1942, demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible and that Soviet forces could conduct successful offensive operations. This psychological victory was as important as the tactical gains because it proved to Soviet soldiers and the Soviet people that German defeat was possible. As 1942 began, the character of the Eastern Front was fundamentally changing. The war of rapid maneuver that had characterized Barbarossa was becoming a war of attrition, where industrial production would prove more important than tactical brilliance. Germany's initial advantages in equipment and training were being offset by American industrial support for the Soviet Union. The statistics were stark and would only become more dramatic as the war continued. In 1942, American factories would produce 47,000 tanks and 48,000 aircraft. Soviet factories, despite evacuation and bombardment, would produce 24,000 tanks and 25,000 aircraft. Combined Allied production exceeded German output by more than 3-to-1 in every major category of military equipment. German leaders began to understand that they faced not just the Soviet Union, but the combined industrial might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. This was a coalition with productive capacity that Germany could not match regardless of tactical victories or territorial gains. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, wrote in his memoirs, "From 1942 onward, we were fighting not just the Red Army, but American factories. Every Soviet tank we destroyed was replaced by 2 new ones. Every aircraft shot down was replaced by 3. This was not a war we could win through military skill alone." The transformation of Soviet military capability through Lend-Lease assistance would become even more apparent during the great battles of 1942 and 1943. At Stalingrad, the Red Army would demonstrate that it could not only resist German attacks, but could also encircle and destroy entire German armies. The equipment used in these operations would increasingly include American-built trucks, aircraft, and communications systems. Soviet tank armies advancing across Eastern Europe would move on American tires, burn American fuel, and maintain contact using American radios. What German generals had dismissed as a temporary setback in the winter of 1941 was actually the beginning of a fundamental shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front. American industrial production was transforming the Soviet Union from a nation on the verge of collapse into a military superpower capable of sustained offensive operations. The 5 million tons of American Lend-Lease aid that would eventually reach the Soviet Union represented more than military equipment. It represented American industrial capacity applied to the destruction of Nazi Germany. Every truck, every aircraft, every ton of aluminum and steel was a tangible expression of American productive power. German strategy on the Eastern Front had been based on the assumption that rapid tactical victories would lead to strategic success before Allied industrial production could affect the balance. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The war would not be won by the army with the best tactics, but by the coalition with the greatest industrial capacity. As spring approached in 1942, both sides prepared for renewed offensive operations. The Wehrmacht, despite winter defeats, remained a formidable force capable of spectacular tactical achievements. But German commanders now understood they faced an enemy whose strength was growing rather than diminishing, sustained by American factories operating thousands of miles beyond the reach of German bombers. The next phase of the Eastern Front would demonstrate whether German military excellence could overcome Allied industrial abundance. The answer would reshape the global balance of power and determine the fate of Nazi Germany's ambitions for a 1,000-year Reich. The summer offensive of 1942 would test whether the Wehrmacht could still achieve decisive victory on the Eastern Front before American industrial support transformed the Red Army into an unstoppable force. Hitler's strategy, designated Operation Blue, called for a massive attack toward the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. German planning for the 1942 campaign reflected both confidence and desperation. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated that Soviet forces had been reduced to 60% of their pre-war strength. German commanders believed that one more massive offensive could shatter Soviet resistance and force Stalin to negotiate a separate peace. Yet the same intelligence reports contained disturbing evidence of Soviet recovery. Red Army units destroyed in 1941 were reappearing with new equipment and improved training. Soviet tank production had not only recovered from the initial disasters, but was actually exceeding pre-war levels, despite the loss of major industrial centers. What German intelligence failed to fully comprehend was that Soviet recovery was being accelerated by American assistance on a scale unprecedented in military history. By mid-1942, Lend-Lease convoys were delivering over 200,000 tons of military supplies monthly to Soviet ports. The Arctic convoy routes from Britain to Murmansk and Archangel operated despite horrific casualties from German U-boats and air attacks. Of the 795 merchant ships that attempted the Arctic crossing during the war, 102 were sunk by German action. Yet the convoys continued, delivering American trucks, tanks, aircraft, and raw materials that sustained Soviet resistance. American trucks proved particularly crucial to Soviet military effectiveness. The Red Army's logistics system had relied heavily on horses and wagons, which could not support mechanized operations. American Lend-Lease provided over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, completely motorizing Soviet supply lines. These trucks were superior to German vehicles in reliability and maintenance requirements. American manufacturers had designed them for mass production and ease of repair. Soviet mechanics could maintain American trucks with basic tools and limited training, while German vehicles required specialized parts and trained technicians. The contrast became apparent during the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in August 1942. German forces advancing toward the city moved slowly, constrained by fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns. Soviet forces defending the city were supplied by American trucks moving at night across the Volga River, carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, later wrote, "American trucks saved Stalingrad. Without them, we could not have sustained our forces in the city. German artillery could destroy our supply depots, but American trucks could replace supplies faster than Germans could destroy them." The siege of Stalingrad revealed the fundamental weakness in German strategy. Wehrmacht tactical superiority was being overwhelmed by Soviet logistical superiority made possible by American production. German soldiers fighting in the rubble of the city faced Soviet defenders who never ran short of ammunition, food, or equipment. Soviet snipers used American-made rifles with telescopic sights. Soviet artillery fired American-manufactured shells. Soviet communications relied on American radios that proved more reliable than German equipment. Every aspect of Soviet defensive capability was enhanced by American industrial production. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was arguably the Wehrmacht's finest formation. It had participated in the conquest of Poland, France, and the early victories of Barbarossa. Its soldiers were experienced, well-trained, and confident. Yet, by November 1942, the Sixth Army was trapped in Stalingrad, surrounded by Soviet forces and facing annihilation. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive that encircled the Sixth Army, was planned and executed using American communications equipment, launched by tank armies equipped with American trucks and supported by Soviet aircraft, many of which were American-built. The tactical concept was Soviet, but the material foundation was American. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German attempts to relieve the Sixth Army failed partly because Wehrmacht supply lines could not match Soviet logistical capacity. German relief columns advanced slowly, constrained by fuel shortages and the need to protect vulnerable supply convoys. Soviet forces opposing them moved rapidly, supplied by American trucks that operated effectively in winter conditions that immobilized German vehicles. The surrender of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked more than a tactical defeat. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could not compensate for material inferiority through tactical excellence. German military superiority, based on training and doctrine, was being negated by Allied industrial superiority. American Lend-Lease assistance to the Soviet Union accelerated dramatically after Stalingrad. Monthly deliveries increased to over 300,000 tons by spring 1943. These shipments included not only finished military equipment, but also raw materials that supported Soviet war production. American aluminum enabled Soviet aircraft factories to increase production by 40%. American steel supplemented Soviet production, which had been reduced by German occupation of industrial areas. American machine tools replaced equipment destroyed during the factory evacuations of 1941. Perhaps most importantly, American food aid prevented famine in Soviet cities and freed Soviet agricultural workers for military service. Lend-Lease provided over 4 million tons of food to the Soviet Union, including meat, flour, sugar, and canned goods, that sustained both military forces and civilian populations. The impact of American food aid was particularly significant because German strategy had deliberately targeted Soviet agriculture. Wehrmacht forces systematically destroyed collective farms, slaughtered livestock, and burned grain stores. German planners calculated that food shortages would force Soviet surrender, even if military resistance continued. American food shipments rendered this strategy ineffective. Soviet cities that should have been starving, according to German calculations, were adequately fed. Soviet soldiers, who should have been weakened by malnutrition, were properly nourished. The biological warfare component of German strategy was defeated by American agricultural abundance. By summer 1943, the transformation of the Eastern Front was complete. Soviet forces were no longer fighting a desperate defensive war. They had achieved material superiority in every category of military equipment and were preparing massive offensive operations designed to drive German forces back to their own borders. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated this transformation dramatically. German forces assembled their largest armoured concentration of the war, over 2,000 tanks and assault guns, for a final attempt to achieve decisive victory on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel was intended to destroy Soviet tank reserves and restore German initiative. The offensive failed catastrophically. Soviet forces, forewarned by intelligence and prepared through months of defensive preparation, absorbed the German attack and launched counteroffensives that shattered German armoured strength. Wehrmacht tank losses at Kursk exceeded German manufacturing capacity for the remainder of the war. Soviet success at Kursk was enabled by American assistance in every aspect of military operations. Soviet tank armies moved to battle positions using American trucks. Soviet aircraft achieving air superiority included significant numbers of American fighters and bombers. Soviet communications coordinating the massive defensive operation relied on American radio equipment. The artillery preparation that preceded Soviet counterattacks consumed American-manufactured ammunition fired from guns that included American artillery pieces. Soviet logistics supporting over 1 million soldiers were maintained by American trucks moving supplies over roads constructed using American engineering equipment. German commanders observing Soviet capabilities at Kursk realized they faced an enemy whose material strength exceeded their own in every category. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's leading tank expert, wrote after the battle, "We are no longer fighting the Red Army of 1941, we are fighting the combined industrial production of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. This is a war we cannot win." American aircraft deliveries to the Soviet Union reached peak levels during 1943. Over 14,000 American aircraft were delivered to Soviet forces, including fighters, bombers, and transport planes. These aircraft were often superior to German equipment and enabled Soviet forces to achieve air superiority over critical battlefields. Soviet pilots flying American P-39 Airacobra fighters found them faster and more maneuverable than most German aircraft. American B-25 Mitchell bombers gave Soviet forces a strategic bombing capability they had previously lacked. American transport aircraft enabled Soviet forces to supply partisans operating behind German lines. The psychological impact of American aircraft was as important as their tactical value. German soldiers who had enjoyed air superiority during the early war now faced constant attack from Soviet aircraft, many of which were obviously American-built. The sight of American-made fighters and bombers operating from Soviet airfields demonstrated Allied cooperation on a scale that German propaganda could not explain away. Raw materials provided through Lend-Lease enabled Soviet industry to exceed pre-war production levels despite the loss of major industrial centers to German occupation. American aluminum, copper, steel, and machine tools supplemented Soviet production and enabled factories relocated beyond the Urals to operate at full capacity. Soviet tank production reached extraordinary levels by late 1943. Monthly production exceeded 3,000 tanks, more than German industry could produce in the same period. Soviet aircraft production similarly exceeded German output. By every measure of industrial capacity, the Soviet Union had achieved superiority over Germany. This industrial superiority was not solely Soviet achievement. American raw materials contributed to approximately 25% of Soviet war production. American machine tools manufactured much of the equipment Soviet factories used. American technical expertise, transferred through Lend-Lease missions, improved Soviet manufacturing efficiency. German intelligence reports from late 1943 revealed growing awareness that the war was lost. Wehrmacht officers observed Soviet equipment that exceeded German capabilities in quantity and often in quality. German soldiers captured Soviet positions and found supplies that exceeded anything available to German forces. The abundance of Soviet supplies, much of it obviously American-manufactured, demoralized German troops who had been told they were fighting a primitive enemy. German propaganda had portrayed the Soviet Union as backward and technologically inferior. The reality German soldiers encountered contradicted this narrative completely. Soviet forces advancing westward from Stalingrad and Kursk moved, with logistical support that German commanders envied. Soviet tank armies advanced hundreds of miles without significant supply difficulties. Soviet aircraft operated from forward airfields that were constructed and supplied faster than German forces could destroy them. The winter offensive of 1943 to 1944 demonstrated Soviet capability to conduct sustained operations, regardless of weather or terrain. Soviet forces liberated Ukraine, crossed the Dnieper River, and advanced toward the borders of Romania and Poland. German forces retreated continuously, unable to establish defensive lines that could withstand Soviet attacks. American equipment enabled this rapid advance. Soviet forces moved on American trucks, communicated using American radios, and maintained contact with rear areas using American aircraft. Soviet engineers built bridges using American construction equipment. Soviet artillery fired American-manufactured ammunition. The liberation of Soviet territory revealed the scale of German destruction and explained Soviet determination to continue fighting regardless of casualties. German forces had systematically destroyed cities, factories, collective farms, and transportation networks. Civilian casualties in occupied areas exceeded military losses. This destruction strengthened Soviet resolve and justified any sacrifice necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. American assistance enabled the Soviet Union to sustain this resolve with effective military action. Without Lend-Lease support, Soviet forces might have been willing to fight but unable to advance. By spring 1944, Soviet forces were preparing for operations that would carry them beyond Soviet borders into Eastern Europe. The Red Army that had nearly collapsed in 1941 was now the most powerful military force in Europe, equipped and supplied through American assistance on an unprecedented scale. The approaching Allied invasion of Western Europe would force Germany to fight on two fronts simultaneously. German forces that might have been concentrated against either the Eastern or Western Front would be divided between two theatres. This strategic situation guaranteed German defeat regardless of tactical outcomes. American assistance to the Soviet Union had achieved its strategic objective. The Eastern Front absorbed the majority of German military strength throughout the war. Wehrmacht divisions fighting Soviet forces could not be transferred to defend France against the Allied invasion. German industrial production was consumed by the demands of Eastern Front operations. The statistics were overwhelming. Of 260 German divisions deployed during the war, 190 fought primarily on the Eastern Front. German casualties in the East exceeded 3 million killed and missing. German equipment losses on the Eastern Front exceeded total German production in many categories. Soviet resistance, sustained by American production, had destroyed the Wehrmacht as an effective fighting force. German military doctrine, training, and leadership proved insufficient to overcome Allied material superiority. The war of attrition that began at Moscow in December 1941 ended with German surrender in May 1945. The 5 million tons of American assistance delivered to the Soviet Union represented more than military aid. It represented American industrial capacity applied to the systematic destruction of Nazi Germany. Every truck, every aircraft, every ton of raw materials contributed to German defeat and Allied victory. January 19, 1945. Führerbunker, Berlin. Adolf Hitler hunched over intelligence reports that told a story of complete catastrophe. Soviet forces were advancing across Poland toward the German border. American bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. The Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine River. Nazi Germany, which Hitler had proclaimed would last 1,000 years, had barely 12 years of existence remaining and perhaps only months of life left. The reports on Hitler's desk contained statistics that revealed the scale of German defeat. Soviet tank armies advancing through Poland possessed over 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Red Army's logistics were maintained by over 500,000 American trucks. Soviet aircraft numbered over 15,000, including substantial numbers of American fighters and bombers. German forces opposing this onslaught could field fewer than 4,000 operational tanks, most of them mechanically unreliable and short of fuel. The Luftwaffe possessed fewer than 2,000 aircraft, many grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. German logistics relied increasingly on horse-drawn wagons because fuel shortages had immobilized much of the Wehrmacht's remaining motor transport. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The same German military that had conquered most of Europe in 2 years was being systematically destroyed by Soviet forces whose material superiority exceeded German capabilities by margins that would have been considered impossible in 1941. What Hitler and his remaining advisors struggled to comprehend was that they faced not merely the Red Army, but the combined industrial production of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union applied to their destruction. The 5 million tons of American Lend-Lease assistance that had reached the Soviet Union represented more military equipment than the entire German military had possessed at the peak of its power. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, reviewing the intelligence reports with Hitler, offered an assessment that captured the hopelessness of Germany's situation. Mein Führer, we face Soviet armies equipped with American trucks, American aircraft, American communications, and American raw materials. Their supply lines stretch back to factories in Detroit and Chicago. We cannot compete with the industrial capacity of 3 continents. The final Soviet offensive, Operation Vistula Oder, launched on January 12, 1945, demonstrated the complete transformation of the Eastern Front since 1941. Soviet forces advanced over 300 miles in 3 weeks, from the Vistula River in Poland to within 40 miles of Berlin. This rate of advance exceeded anything achieved by German forces during their most successful operations. The speed of the Soviet advance was enabled by logistics systems that German commanders found incomprehensible. Soviet tank armies maintained their advance without significant supply difficulties, despite operating hundreds of miles from their starting positions. Soviet aircraft provided continuous close air support throughout the offensive. German resistance collapsed not primarily because of tactical defeats, but because Wehrmacht units ran out of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts faster than they could be resupplied. German logistics, strained beyond capacity, could not support effective defensive operations against enemies whose supply lines never failed. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, now chief of the German General Staff, observed the Soviet offensive from his headquarters and understood that military skill could not overcome material disparity of this magnitude. He later wrote, "The Red Army of 1945 bore no resemblance to the force we had nearly destroyed in 1941. American assistance had transformed Soviet military capability beyond recognition. American Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union reached peak efficiency during the final year of the war. Monthly deliveries exceeded 400,000 tons by early 1945. These shipments included not only military equipment but also industrial machinery that enabled Soviet factories to increase production even as German forces retreated. The statistics of American assistance were staggering and would have seemed impossible to achieve when the program began in 1941. Total Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union included 400,000 trucks and jeeps, 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, over 1 million tons of food, and massive quantities of raw materials, including aluminum, steel, copper, and petroleum products. Soviet forces advancing toward Berlin moved on American tires, burned American gasoline, and maintained communications using American radio equipment. Soviet artillery fired ammunition manufactured from American raw materials. Soviet aircraft included American fighters that proved superior to most German designs. The psychological impact on German forces was devastating. Wehrmacht soldiers, captured by advancing Soviet forces, found themselves surrounded by evidence of American industrial power. German prisoners reported seeing endless columns of American trucks, American jeeps, and American aircraft operating under Soviet command. The abundance of Allied equipment demoralized German troops, who had been told they were fighting primitive enemies with inferior technology. German propaganda had consistently portrayed the Soviet Union as backward and the United States as decadent and industrially weak. The reality German soldiers encountered contradicted these narratives completely. Lieutenant Rudolf Sommer of the 3rd Panzer Division, captured during the Soviet offensive in January 1945, told his interrogators, "We were informed that the Soviets lacked modern equipment and that American industrial production was inefficient. Instead, we faced enemies with equipment superior to our own in quantity and often in quality. Every Soviet position we attacked was supplied better than our own forces." The final battles for German territory revealed the complete reversal of the military situation since 1941. German forces defending their homeland possessed fewer tanks than Soviet spearheads, fewer aircraft than Soviet air armies, and inadequate logistics to sustain defensive operations. Soviet forces crossing into German territory in February 1945 found a country whose industrial capacity had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. German tank production had fallen to fewer than 800 vehicles monthly. Aircraft production had virtually ceased due to shortages of aluminum and fuel. The contrast with Soviet production capabilities was overwhelming. Soviet factories, many of them equipped with American machinery and supplied with American raw materials, were producing over 3,000 tanks monthly. Soviet aircraft production exceeded German output by margins exceeding 10-1. American assistance had not merely supplemented Soviet production, it had enabled the Soviet Union to achieve industrial superiority over Germany, despite losing major industrial centers to occupation. This achievement would have been impossible without American raw materials, machine tools, and technical expertise. The Battle of Berlin, fought from mid-April to early May 1945, demonstrated the final consequences of German miscalculations about American industrial capacity. Soviet forces surrounding the German capital possessed overwhelming superiority in every category of military equipment. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front included over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, many of them moving on American chassis or supplied through American assistance. Soviet artillery concentrated against Berlin exceeded 10,000 guns, firing ammunition that included substantial quantities of American-manufactured shells. German forces defending Berlin could field fewer than 800 operational tanks, most of them immobilized by fuel shortages. German artillery was rationed to fewer than 10 rounds per gun per day. German aircraft were virtually non-existent, with the Luftwaffe capable of flying fewer than 100 sorties daily. The disparity was so enormous that tactical skill became irrelevant. German soldiers, many of them teenagers with minimal training, faced Soviet armies equipped with the most modern weapons American and Soviet industry could produce. The outcome was predetermined by industrial capacity rather than military prowess. Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, symbolized the complete failure of German strategy. The leader who had dismissed American industrial potential and underestimated Soviet resilience died in a bunker surrounded by the wreckage of his empire, destroyed by forces equipped through American abundance and sustained by Soviet determination. The German surrender on May 8, 1945, ended the most destructive war in human history. German military casualties exceeded 5 million killed. German civilian casualties approached 2 million. German industrial capacity was destroyed. The German state ceased to exist. Soviet casualties were even higher, exceeding 27 million military and civilian dead. But the Soviet Union survived, emerged victorious, and established itself as a global superpower. This survival and victory were enabled by American assistance that provided the material foundation for Soviet resistance and eventual triumph. American Lend-Lease assistance to the Soviet Union represented one of the most successful strategic investments in American history. The program cost approximately $11 billion in wartime values, equivalent to over $150 billion in contemporary purchasing power. This investment achieved American strategic objectives at a fraction of the cost of direct military intervention. By supporting Soviet resistance, the United States ensured that Germany would be forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously when America entered the war. German divisions committed to the Eastern Front could not be transferred to defend against Allied invasions in Italy and France. German industrial production was consumed by the demands of fighting the Red Army. The Eastern Front absorbed approximately 75% of German military strength throughout the war. German casualties in the East exceeded all other theaters combined. German equipment losses on the Eastern Front exceeded total German production in many categories. The Wehrmacht was effectively destroyed by Soviet forces equipped through American assistance. Post-war analysis by German military leaders revealed their complete misunderstanding of American industrial capacity and determination. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his memoirs, "We calculated that America could not significantly affect the European war before 1944. We assumed American production would be consumed by Pacific operations against Japan. We never imagined American industry could supply both theaters simultaneously while maintaining substantial assistance to allies." Field Marshal Erich von Manstein offered a more fundamental critique of German strategy. "We fought the war as if it were still 1864, emphasizing tactical excellence and operational art. Our enemies fought it as an industrial conflict where production capacity determined outcomes. They were correct, and we were catastrophically wrong." The transformation of the Soviet Union from near collapse in 1941 to victory in 1945 represented one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. This transformation was enabled by the combination of Soviet human resources, Soviet industrial capacity, and American material assistance on an unprecedented scale. Soviet forces that entered Berlin in May 1945 bore no resemblance to the Red Army that had suffered catastrophic defeats during Barbarossa. They were equipped with modern weapons, supplied by efficient logistics, and supported by overwhelming firepower. Much of this capability derived from American assistance. American trucks maintained Soviet supply lines. American aircraft provided close air support. American communications equipment coordinated operations involving millions of soldiers. American raw materials enabled Soviet factories to produce the weapons that armed advancing Soviet armies. The strategic consequences extended far beyond German defeat. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a military superpower capable of projecting force throughout Eastern Europe and beyond. This capability was built on the foundation of American assistance that had enabled Soviet survival and victory. The Cold War that began immediately after German surrender reflected the unintended consequences of American assistance to the Soviet Union. The Red Army that occupied Eastern Europe possessed equipment and logistics capabilities that had been developed through American aid. The Soviet military-industrial complex that threatened American interests during the Cold War had been strengthened by American assistance during World War II. American policymakers had understood these risks, but considered them acceptable given the alternative of German victory. President Roosevelt's decision to provide massive assistance to Stalin's regime despite ideological opposition reflected strategic calculation that German defeat was more important than post-war concerns about Soviet power. The success of Lend-Lease assistance to the Soviet Union validated American assumptions about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power in modern warfare. The nation with the greatest productive capacity could equip allies, sustain lengthy conflicts, and ultimately overwhelm enemies, regardless of initial military advantages. German military excellence, tactical innovation, and operational brilliance proved insufficient to overcome Allied industrial superiority. The Wehrmacht's early victories were negated by American factories that produced military equipment faster than Germans could destroy it. The final statistics of American assistance to the Soviet Union revealed the scale of this industrial achievement. 5 million tons of equipment and supplies delivered across thousands of miles of ocean and hostile territory. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles that enabled Soviet mobility, thousands of aircraft that provided Soviet air power, millions of tons of raw materials that sustained Soviet production. These numbers represented more than military aid. They represented American industrial democracy applied to the destruction of totalitarian dictatorship. They demonstrated that free societies possessed productive advantages that authoritarian regimes could not match despite tactical efficiency and social control. The legacy of American assistance to the Soviet Union extended beyond World War II to influence global power relationships throughout the Cold War era. The United States had demonstrated its capacity to sustain allies across any distance, in any climate, against any enemy. This demonstration deterred potential aggressors and reassured allies for decades afterward. The German generals who had laughed at American logistics and dismissed Soviet resistance learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare. In industrial conflicts, victory belongs to the coalition with the greatest productive capacity, not necessarily to the side with the best soldiers or most brilliant commanders. The 5 million tons of American aid that crushed Germany's Eastern strategy proved that logistics is strategy, that industrial capacity determines military outcomes, and that democratic societies possess inherent advantages in lengthy conflicts that tactical excellence cannot overcome. The Red Army that raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin rode to victory in American trucks, flew in American aircraft, and communicated through American radios. Their triumph was simultaneously Soviet courage and American abundance applied to the systematic destruction of Nazi Germany. This achievement stands as testament to what democratic nations can accomplish when their survival and values are threatened. The factories of Detroit and Chicago proved more decisive than the battlefields of Moscow and Stalingrad in determining the outcome of the war that shaped the modern world.